The storm that struck Wyoming territory on the night of April 18, 1878, came with the fury of 1,000 enraged spirits driving sheets of rain across the endless prairie, while lightning carved jagged scars through the black sky like God's own artillery. Thunder rolled across the vast expanse, with the sound of 10,000 buffalo stampeding toward judgment, shaking the earth beneath a rough-hewn cabin that squatted beside the swollen Blacktail River, like a lone sentinel defying nature's wrath. Inside the modest structure, Coda pressed his scarred back against the chinked log wall and counted shadows moving with predatory purpose through the storm-bent cottonwoods. His weathered fingers traced the familiar weight of his Winchester Model 1873, checking the action with movements worn smooth by 15 years of necessity and survival on the frontier. 4 rounds left in the magazine brass cartridges that gleamed dully in the firelight. One chamber remained loaded in his Colt single-action army, the blued steel warm against his palm from hours of vigilant waiting. The bone needle kit his Aunt Morning Star had sewn into his traditional beaded sash, pressed against his ribs sacred tools for mending flesh when bullets found their mark, as they inevitably did in this unforgiving territory, where death rode every trail like an unwelcome companion. The cabin door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying like deadly hornets, the wrought iron hinges screaming in metallic protest as wind and rain swept into the warm interior with violent purpose. 2 of the 3 coal oil lamps guttered out in sudden puffs of acrid smoke, leaving only the stone fireplace to push back the encroaching darkness that seemed alive with malevolent intention. A figure stumbled across the threshold legs, buckling like a newborn colt's, and collapsed onto the rough-hewn pine planks with a sound that made Coda's warrior heart clench like a fist around hot coals. The crash of her small body hitting solid wood echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, followed by the softer sound of desperate, exhausted breathing that spoke of horrors endured and narrowly escaped. A woman. Young, maybe 22 summers by his careful reckoning, with hair the color of autumn wheat now plastered against her skull by the merciless downpour. Her white cotton chemise hung in tatters, the fine fabric torn by rough usage and rougher treatment. Dark stains, blood, mud, and worse marked the delicate material like accusations written in pain and humiliation. But it was the leather collar encircling her slender throat that transformed Coda's concern into cold, murderous rage that burned in his chest like forge fire. The crude strip of cowhide had been sawed through with desperate haste, leaving an angry red welt that circled her neck like livestock, branding burned into human flesh. Raw skin wept crimson where the leather had chafed during days of captivity, and her small hands, soft hands, that had never known hard labor, clutched at the severed collar with desperate, shaking fingers that spoke of horrors no decent person should endure. "I took it off," she gasped, her voice cracking like thin ice over deep water. Each word emerged through chattering teeth, terror and cold combining to rob her of coherent speech. "Please, merciful heaven above, I cut it off myself with these hands." Coda remained motionless for 3 measured heartbeats, his dark eyes the color of river stones worn smooth by centuries of current, fixed on that terrible mark around her throat, while rage built in his chest like a gathering storm. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the cedar-shake roof and her ragged, terrified breathing that came in short gasps like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Something cold and violent twisted in his gut at the sight of that welted skin, not the claiming fury of masculine possession, but the vigilant shield of a warrior who understood what chains meant and what they cost the human spirit. In his mind flashed memories of his own people's suffering and the reservation boundaries that were chains of a different sort, the broken treaties that collared entire nations with invisible bonds of bureaucratic control. Moving with deliberate, unthreatening care, He set the Winchester against the fieldstone fireplace and approached her as he might a wounded doe, slowly calloused palms, visible and empty threat contained, but strength evident in every measured step. Kneeling on the splintered planks that still bore axe marks from their cutting, he placed his battle-scarred hands gently on her trembling shoulders, feeling the tremors that ran through her small frame like earthquake aftershocks. "You are safe within these walls," he said, his voice carrying the ironclad resolve of bedrock and twice the reliability. "No man will put chains on you again while breath remains in my body and blood flows through my veins. This I swear by the spirits of my ancestors, who watch over us both." Outside the cabin, the storm's fury seemed to intensify, as if nature herself was angry at what had transpired under her watchful sky. Horses splashed through the rising creek, their iron shoes striking sparks from the stone bottom with each desperate step that carried their riders closer to violence. Harsh voices carried on the wind, rough and cruel, as winter itself calling orders through the tempest, like demons organizing their unholy hunt for lost and wounded prey. The woman's eyes green as spring grass. After the first prairie rain, he noticed with a warrior's attention to meaningful detail went wide with terror so pure it was almost sacred in its intensity. "Blackjack Crow?" She whispered the name falling from her lips, like a curse powerful enough to poison the very air itself. "They're coming back for what they claim as their rightful property." Koda's jaw tightened until the muscles jumped beneath his copper skin like trapped animals seeking freedom from captivity. Every Lakota warrior from the Canadian border to the Platte River knew that name, and none spoke it without spitting afterward to cleanse their mouths of its foulness. Crow's gang stole horses from the tribes and sold them to corrupt ranchers with altered brands, but if the stories whispered around council fires during the long winter nights held any truth, they trafficked in more than just livestock. "What name do you go by?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible above the storm's rage. "Leonora Sinclair," she replied, struggling to compose herself despite the terror that still gripped her small frame. "My father Heinrich and I came from Prussia on the immigrant ships 2 years back. He was an accountant, kept precise books for merchants and traders back in the old country." The name struck Koda like lightning. Heinrich Sinclair, he remembered the man now, a meticulous German immigrant who had helped track down a different set of stolen horses 18 months ago. Sinclair had possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot irregularities in official documents, his trained eye catching discrepancies that others missed entirely. "Heinrich Sinclair," Koda repeated slowly. Thin man wire spectacles worked for overland freight. "You knew Papa." Hope flickered in her green eyes like candlelight in a dark room. "I knew him as an honest man in a territory where such men are rare as hen's teeth. He helped me recover horses stolen from the Blackfoot Reservation, asked for no payment beyond the satisfaction of seeing justice served." "That sounds like Papa. He always said numbers never lied, even when people did." Her voice caught with grief and memory. "He died of fever on the wagon train west of Fort Laramie, left me with debts to work off and knowledge I couldn't use because most folks don't think a woman should understand anything more complicated than cooking and cleaning." Thunder crashed overhead, like the gods themselves waging war, as Koda rose and moved to the stone fireplace. He grabbed the severed leather collar from her trembling fingers and hurled it into the flames with violent satisfaction, watching the crude material curl and blacken like a dying snake. The acrid stench of burning hide filled the small room, a smell both final and absolute, as Judgment Day itself. "My name is Koda of the Oglala Lakota," he said while securing the heavy wooden door with its iron bar, the metal clicking into place with reassuring finality. "I tracked the horses they stole from my people ponies sacred to our ceremonies and our very way of life. These horses you speak of, you have seen them with your own eyes." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, drawing strength from his calm authority. "Yes, dozens of beautiful ponies with traditional markings painted on their hides like ancient prayers. They're changing the brands in a hidden canyon corral somewhere north of Carbon Creek. I heard them talking about their partner, too. Mean Mike Rourke, the cattle foreman, who works for the big syndicate out of Cheyenne." Coda extinguished the remaining oil lamp with practiced efficiency, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the orange glow from the fireplace. Shadows danced on the log walls like ancient spirits come to witness what would unfold in this place, where fates would be decided by courage and gunpowder. "Get behind that bed frame and stay low," he commanded quietly, positioning his body between her and the door, like a human shield forged from determination and warrior's pride. These walls are thick pine seasoned hard, but bullets have a way of finding what they seek when there's enough of them flying. The horses were closer now, maybe 30 yards, and closing with each thunderous heartbeat. He counted at least 6 riders based on the sound of hoofbeats striking stone, possibly 8. Far too many for a direct confrontation, especially with a civilian to protect and limited ammunition to work with. A voice boomed through the storm like thunder, given human form gravelly and mean as a diamondback's warning rattle. "We know you're holed up in there, little songbird. Come on out peaceful-like, and maybe nobody gets hurt worse than they already are." Coda pressed his eye to a narrow gap between the chinked logs, studying the enemy with a warrior's tactical assessment. 6 men on horseback sat their mounts in the pelting rain rifles ready and faces hidden beneath slouch hats that had seen better decades. The leader wore a black coat that flapped in the wind like a carrion bird's wings and spoke with the casual authority of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted through force and intimidation. "She's got nowhere to run, boys," the voice continued with lazy confidence. "Creeks rising fast from the mountain snow, and we got all the trails covered neat as Sunday service. Might as well make this easy on yourselves." Lightning split the sky like God's own artillery, illuminating the cabin in stark white relief. In that brief moment of clarity, Coda saw additional movement in the trees, at least 3 more riders circling behind them, like wolves positioning for the kill. 9 men total, all of them seasoned killers. Behind him, Leonora's breathing came in short, frightened gasps. He could smell her fear sharp and clean beneath the wood smoke and damp night air. But underneath the terror, he sensed something else, a core of steel that reminded him of her father's unwavering dedication to truth and precision. "Can you fit through that window?" he whispered. She studied the narrow opening with calculating eyes. "Yes, but they'll see me the moment I'm outside. Not if I give them something else to think about." Moving with practiced stealth, Coda crept to the fireplace and grabbed a burning branch, wrapping it in an old wool blanket. The makeshift torch flared to life, casting wild shadows that leaped and danced like demons celebrating a harvest of souls. He positioned it strategically near the front door where it would draw concentrated gunfire. "When I kick that shutter open, you go straight to the river gully," he instructed with absolute authority. "Do not look back. Do not hesitate. Do not stop for anything short of death itself." The first shot came without warning, punching through the cabin wall inches from his head and showering him with splinters that drew blood from his cheek. Then the night erupted in violence. As Crow's men opened fire from multiple directions, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Coda kicked the wooden shutter open, with enough force to send it flying into the storm. The crack echoed like a gunshot, immediately drawing concentrated return fire that turned the torch into a blazing target. "Run!" he shouted. Leonora squeezed through the narrow window and dropped to the muddy ground below. Coda followed, rolling as he hit the earth with his Winchester clutched against his chest. More shots cracked through the night, and a bullet burned across his left shoulder, tearing through buckskin and flesh, but missing bone by a prayer's width. They stumbled through tall prairie grass toward the swollen creek feet, sliding on rain-slick slopes. Behind them, harsh voices bellowed orders as Crow's men realized their quarry had escaped. "There by the water," someone shouted. "Don't let them reach the creek." The Blacktail River rushed past in a brown torrent, heavy with mountain runoff and angry enough to drown a man in 3 feet of churning water. Debris swept by in the current-broken branches, fence posts, the occasional dead animal, like omens of their potential fate. "Down?" Coda hissed, pulling Leonora into muddy reeds at the water's edge. They pressed themselves flat against the slippery bank as horses thundered past overhead riders, cursing the darkness and rain, in language that would shame the devil himself. Coda pulled his elk-hide war cloak over both of them, creating a pocket of shared warmth in the freezing night air. Their bodies pressed together from necessity breath, mingling in the confined space, while hearts hammered against ribs like caged birds. For a moment, stretching toward eternity, they lay perfectly still, listening to the search party crash through undergrowth above them. The wound in Coda's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, blood seeping warm through his torn shirt. Leonora's hand found his uninjured arm, her fingers gripping with surprising strength. "Your shoulder," she whispered, feeling the wetness of blood. "You're hurt. It will keep until we reach safety. Papa taught me some doctoring frontier families had to know such things. Let me look at it when we get clear of this." They remained hidden until angry voices faded and hoofbeats moved off toward the main trail. Only when comparative silence reclaimed the storm-lashed night did Coda ease back the cloak and peer into the tempest. "We make for Carbon Creek," he decided. "Dr. Solomon will provide aid, and there's a schoolteacher who knows these mountains better than any cavalry scout." The journey to town proved treacherous. They made their way through back alleys and forgotten paths, staying deep in shadows cast by saloons, trading posts, and establishments that catered to men's baser appetites. Carbon Creek never truly slept. Too much money changed hands in darkness for that luxury, but the vicious storm had driven most sensible folks indoors. Leonora clutched the torn edges of her chemise together, trying to cover the worst damage, but the collar mark on her neck was impossible to hide. Every man they passed took notice, some with idle curiosity, others with predatory interest. Coda positioned his broad frame between her and the street, his right hand resting casually on his knife handle. "Keep your head down," he murmured. "Walk like you belong here, not like you're running from hell itself." Dr. Solomon Hirsch's medical office occupied a small building behind Morrison's general store, reeking of carbolic acid and healing herbs. The man himself answered their soft knock, slight and scholarly, maybe 40 years old, with kind eyes behind wire spectacles and gentle hands dedicated to mending what violence broke. Something about the doctor struck Coda as slightly off, though he couldn't identify exactly what bothered him. Perhaps it was how Solomon's eyes lingered on Leonora's injuries, or how his questions seemed designed to elicit specific details rather than assess medical needs. The warrior in Coda filed these observations away, while accepting the offered help. Great, merciful heavens. Solomon breathed upon seeing Leonora's condition, immediately ushering them inside and pulling heavy curtains tight. What manner of animals perpetrated this abomination? While Solomon cleaned and treated both Leonora's rope burns and Coda's bullet graze, Coda explained about the stolen horses and Crow's expanding criminal empire. The doctor listened with apparent growing anger, his professional calm cracking as he examined evidence of systematic brutality. "I've seen similar marks before," Solomon admitted grimly, preparing his dry plate camera, one of perhaps a dozen such devices in the entire territory. 4 other women in the past 18 months, all bearing comparable injuries. I documented everything, but without living witnesses willing to testify. He shrugged helplessly, then composed an urgent telegram to Deputy Marshal Claude Merritt in Medicine Bow. Key, witness to Crow gang crimes. Life in immediate danger. Require protection and swift justice. But their sanctuary proved brief. Through the curtained window, they watched wanted posters being nailed to every post and building the sound of hammers echoing like nails driven into coffins. Content warning. The following period document contains a historical slur reproduced for accuracy. Coda's features were sketched above words that made his blood simmer. Wanted thieving squaw men and runaway property. $750 reward. Dead or alive preferred. Rourke's got armed men on every corner, Solomon observed. You can't leave by main roads without walking into their arms. But there's a woman, Guinevere Sloan, runs the schoolhouse in the mining district. She knows these mountains like they were mapped in her mind. Before they could plan further, heavy boots thundered on the back stairs. The rear door splintered inward, and 3 of Crow's riders burst through with guns drawn, their faces marked by professional brutality. The first man, scarred and tobacco-stained, grabbed Leonora, while his partner covered the room with a sawed-off shotgun. The third positioned himself by the front door, cutting off escape. Easy money tonight. The first grinned, showing broken teeth. Boss wants his property back undamaged. Coda tensed to spring, but the shotgun swung toward him. Don't try it, Chief. We got orders to bring the girl back breathing, but you can meet your ancestors any way that suits us. Dr. Solomon backed against his medicine cabinet, hands raised, but Coda noticed the man's eyes darting toward a particular drawer. The man holding Leonora started backing toward the door, his arm tight around her throat. She struggled against his grip, face turning red, but he laughed and squeezed harder. That's when she remembered her father's ledger knife, a small, wickedly sharp blade kept in her boot as the only memento of their old life in Prussia. Working it free with desperate care, she waited until his attention wandered and then drove the steel deep into his wrist. He screamed and released her bright blood, spurting in pulsing streams. She rolled away as Coda surged forward, tackling the second gunman before he could fire. They crashed through a cabinet of medical supplies in an explosion of glass and chemical smells. The third man raised his pistol toward Coda's back, but Dr. Solomon suddenly produced a small derringer and shot the gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around. "Forgive me," Solomon said quietly, "but I couldn't let them murder you in my office." The wounded man from the struggle stumbled toward the ruined entrance, clutching his slashed wrist. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Crow's got this territory sewed up tight." They were already moving, following Solomon down into his coal cellar through narrow stairs that creaked under their weight. The underground space was cramped and dusty, filled with musty smells of old timber and forgotten storage. Solomon moved heavy crates aside to reveal a tunnel connecting to the millinery shop next door, a passageway suggesting this wasn't his first time helping people disappear. This tunnel system connects most buildings in the commercial district, Solomon explained. Built during Indian troubles 5 years back. In the cramped tunnel darkness, Leonora insisted on properly treating Coda's wounded shoulder despite his protests. Her hands had grown remarkably steady during their ordeal crisis, having burned away fear and uncertainty. "Let me help," she said, when he tried to manage the injury himself. A warrior does not show weakness to those he protects. A wise woman recognizes when her partner needs assistance. She replied firmly, taking the bone needle from his grip. "Besides, Papa taught me field medicine during our travels." Her touch proved both gentle and sure, As she guided the needle through torn flesh, green eyes focused on his weathered face rather than the wound. In dim light filtering from above, something profound passed between them, an acknowledgement transcending their desperate circumstances. "Tell me about your father," Coda said, partly to distract from pain and partly from genuine interest. "Heinrich believed numbers told truth when people wouldn't," she said, working carefully. "He kept books for Hamburg merchants before we came to America. Said he wanted to give me opportunities the old country couldn't provide." She paused, expression growing distant. "He had grand plans, said America was where a woman might use her education for more than keeping house and bearing children. He was teaching me advanced accounting, even basic surveying and legal document preparation." "What changed those plans?" "Fever took him west of Fort Laramie. 3 days of delirium, then gone. Left me with debts and knowledge I couldn't use because folks don't think women should understand anything complicated." "Your father sounds like a man of vision." "He was careful, maybe too careful. He kept duplicate records of everything, said you never knew when someone might try altering books after the fact." She finished the bandage, looking directly into his eyes. "That's why I still carry his private ledger copies of territorial filings he processed, including some he suspected were fraudulent." Coda felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of fraudulent filings?" "Land deeds, water rights, transfers, mining claims, documents that didn't add up when cross-referenced with territorial surveys. He planned to report his suspicions, but he died before he could act." "Exactly. I've been carrying his evidence ever since, not knowing who to trust or how to use it." The implications were staggering. If Heinrich Sinclair had documented systematic fraud in territorial filings, it might expose corruption extending far beyond Crow's gang, to include territorial officials and survey commissioners. "When this ends," Coda promised, "we'll retrieve that ledger and see your father's work serves justice as he intended." They emerged into Morrison's millinery shop, empty at this late hour. Through windows, they could see Crow's men patrolling with torches, searching every shadow with methodical thoroughness. Following back alleys toward town's edge, they moved from shadow to shadow. The abandoned mining road, Leonora remembered from her arrival, proved treacherous in darkness, barely wide enough for a wagon, and pitted with holes that could break bones. The climb to Whirlwind Gulch took 2 hours through increasingly dangerous terrain. During rest stops, huddled behind boulders for shelter, Leonora shared more about her father's discoveries. "He said the pattern was too consistent for coincidence," she explained quietly. "Land deeds for property already owned by others, water rights transferred without compensation, mining claims on reservation land protected by federal treaty. Someone was systematically stealing legal title using forged documents. Papa thought so. And he believed the forgeries were sophisticated because they came from someone with access to official forms and territorial seals. Someone inside the government. Had to be. Papa said handwriting on suspicious documents looked familiar, like he'd seen it in legitimate filings, but couldn't place where." They reached the one-room schoolhouse as it glowed warmly against darkness. Children's voices reciting lessons, families pursuing education by lamplight after dangerous day shifts underground. But Coda's warrior instincts detected shadows moving in surrounding trees. His blood chilled as realization struck Crow had anticipated their destination. The schoolhouse was surrounded. "Blast it all," he muttered, pulling Leonora behind a fallen cottonwood. 8 men, maybe more. Through bright windows, they could see Guinevere Sloane conducting class, a woman in her 30s, with gray hair and no-nonsense bearing earned through years civilizing frontier children. "We have to warn them," Leonora whispered. "Carefully, innocent blood must not be spilled if we can prevent it." They crawled through wet grass, using every scrap of cover. The schoolhouse had a small crawl space underneath, originally for storage, but now their only hope of reaching children before violence erupted. Working with desperate efficiency, they pried up loose floorboards and began pulling children into the crawl space in absolute silence. Each small body had to pass through without sound, while parents above continued lessons maintaining the illusion of normalcy. But one child, a tow-headed boy named Tommy, panicked seeing Leonora's condition. His terrified cry echoed through the building just as Crow's patience ended. "Now!" came the shout from outside. Gunfire erupted with volcanic intensity, shattering windows, while the blackboard disintegrated in sharp fragments. Children screamed and dove under desks as bullets punched through thin walls. Guinevere threw herself over the smallest students, using her body as a shield. In the crawl space, Coda positioned an old stovepipe to catch firelight, creating movement illusion. He lit papers to generate smoke, drawing attackers' fire away from the real evacuation. "When I signal, run like the devil's chasing you," he told Leonora. "Get the children to Guinevere, head for the mine shaft where timber will stop bullets. I won't leave you." "Go!" he shouted as bullets tore through the decoy. The diversion worked long enough to evacuate most children, though not without cost. 3 youngsters suffered minor glass cuts, and Guinevere took a bullet graze across her forearm that bled freely but missed bone. As they stumbled toward mining claims, carrying wounded and hurting terrified children, Crow's voice bellowed like a demon, "Burn it down! Smoke them out!" The schoolhouse erupted in orange flames, licking at storm clouds, turning night hellish, while years of learning fed the conflagration. But they'd saved the children and gained an ally in Guinevere, a woman knowing every trail and hiding place. "There's a freight yard at the railroad spur," she gasped as they caught breath in minework safety. "Andrew Pike runs wagons for smaller outfits homesteader, whose water rights Rourke wants to steal. He'll have a wagon and knows back trails to Medicine Bow." The mention of Pike stirred memory in Coda's mind. Andrew Pike had testified at territorial hearings about water rights irregularities threatening his irrigation. If Pike was involved in the fraud pattern Heinrich Sinclair investigated, his cooperation might provide crucial evidence. Dawn was climbing toward noon on their 4th day when they reached the freight yard, squatting beside railroad tracks like weathered bones. Andrew Pike waited with a canvas-covered wagon and 4 sturdy mules, his weathered face set in grim determination. Pike appeared mid-30s with lean build and sun-darkened skin of someone wrestling living from unforgiving soil. His patched but clean clothes, worn but serviceable boots, and meticulously maintained Springfield rifle spoke of military experience. "Heard about the schoolhouse?" he said without preamble, checking his rifle. "Also heard about Miss Leonora. Rourke's dam has been stealing water from every small farmer for months. About time someone stood up to these buzzards." As they prepared to load, Pike pulled Coda aside. "There's something else. I knew Heinrich Sinclair. We worked together, documenting water rights irregularities for the territorial commissioner. He mentioned having additional evidence records that might expose the whole corrupt system. Leonora told me about her father's private ledger. Then you know its importance. But there's more, something Heinrich discovered before he died that scared him enough to consider leaving the territory entirely." "What did he find?" Pike's expression grew grim. He figured out who was behind forged documents. Said handwriting on fraudulent papers belonged to someone he'd worked with, someone in a position creating official documents passing any inspection. "Did he tell you who?" "Montgomery Hale, the territorial clerk." Heinrich was certain said he'd studied enough of Hale's legitimate documents to recognize particular flourishes and letter formations. But he needed more proof before accusing such a prominent official. The revelation hit like thunderbolt, like If Heinrich Sinclair had identified Hale 18 months ago, corruption ran deeper and operated longer than anyone suspected. But as they finished loading, hoofbeats echoed across the rail yard. Rourke's foreman appeared with 8 armed men blocking their escape route with casual authority. The foreman was thick-set with cruel eyes and elaborate mustache, suggesting considerable mirror time. Expensive clothes and well-maintained weapons marked him as someone profiting handsomely from criminal enterprise. "That's company property you're interfering with," he declared with proprietary arrogance. "Step down and explain yourselves to proper authorities." "The only authority I recognize is law," Pike replied steadily, knuckles white on reins. "Last I checked, helping folks escape murderers wasn't against territorial statute. You're harboring fugitives and stolen property. That makes you accessories." "What crimes?" Guinevere interjected, her teacher's voice carrying authority from dealing with bullies. "Escaping kidnappers, defending children, seeking justice through legal channels." The confrontation erupted without warning. One of Rourke's men grabbed for Leonora, and Coda vaulted from the wagon, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a blow, dropping him like a felled tree. Pike whipped mules into motion as men dove for cover. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, rifle cracks mixing with shotgun booms and pistol whines. A rifle ball took Pike in the left shoulder, spinning him in the driver's seat. But he maintained his grip on leather reins with blood-slick hands and iron determination. The wagon careened downhill like a runaway stagecoach, bouncing over rocks and ruts while scattering confused cattle. "Can you handle this, team?" Pike gasped, crimson, seeping through his shirt. Leonora grabbed reins while Coda provided covering fire, each shot carefully aimed to drive pursuers back without wasting ammunition. She'd never driven a team before, but desperation steadied her hands, while mules seemed to sense urgency. Behind them, dust clouds marked pursuit, but their head start kept them ahead of immediate capture. They'd bought time with blood and courage, but at terrible cost. Pike's wound was serious, and they were still miles from safety. As they fled through Dakota Badlands, Pike shared more about Heinrich Sinclair's investigation and evidence possibly hidden in Leonora's boarding house room. "Your father was thorough," he told her, gritting teeth against pain. "Said he'd copied every suspicious document processed in his last 6 months, cross-referenced them with territorial surveys, and identified patterns proving systematic fraud." "What patterns?" Coda asked while scanning their back trail. "False land deeds covering same properties multiple times, water rights transfers from legitimate homesteaders to shell companies that didn't exist, mining claims for reservation land protected by federal treaty." Pike coughed, blood flecking his lips. Heinrich calculated someone had stolen legal title to over 50,000 acres of prime Wyoming territory using forged documents. 2 hours later, their flight was interrupted by a tremendous explosion shaking ground like earthquake. Smoke and dust billowed from mountainside ahead, men shouting for help in multiple languages, a desperate chorus of human need. "Mine disaster at Whirlwind Gulch," Pike explained through gritted teeth, face growing pale. "Silverworks, if there's been cave-in, they'll need every hand." The blast had gone catastrophically wrong, trapping 15 workers underground in collapsed tunnels and broken timbers. The disaster site was chaos. Women screaming for husbands, children crying for fathers, rescue workers organizing bucket brigades. Guinevere immediately took charge, her natural authority invaluable in coordinating rescue efforts. But she was adamant they couldn't abandon trapped miners. "I won't leave these people to die while I run from troubles," she declared, when Coda suggested continuing immediately. "Some trapped men are fathers of my students' children who just lost their schoolhouse and might become orphans." No moral argument could counter that simple statement of duty and decency. They joined the rescue despite desperate circumstances, working alongside miners, shopkeepers, and anyone willing to risk lives for neighbors. The rescue proved backbreaking and dangerous. They formed human chains passing debris from collapsed shafts, while professional miners worked toward trapped workers through spaces barely wide enough for shoulders. Cave-ins threatened constantly, and poisonous gases from broken timbers made breathing difficult. Koda's wounded shoulder reopened under tremendous strain, blood seeping as he hauled ropes and lifted beams, challenging 3 ordinary men. Leonora labored beside him, her small hands surprisingly strong, as they pulled together movements, becoming synchronized through shared effort and growing trust. The work brought contact with miners from half-dozen countries seeking opportunity in Wyoming territory, and finding dangerous work barely paying enough to feed families. Many spoke of irregularities in claims paperwork, missing documentation, costing rights to lucrative sites. "Happened to my brother," said Norwegian miner Lars during brief rest. Filed proper claim on good silver vein, paid fees, got official receipt. 3 months later, territorial office says no record of his filing, and some big syndicate owns the land. Similar stories emerged, legitimate claims, mysteriously vanishing, small operators forced off profitable sites by companies with suspiciously perfect paperwork. Territorial officials remarkably unhelpful resolving disputes, favoring individual miners. The pattern Heinrich Sinclair identified was even more extensive than realized. Someone wasn't just stealing farmland and water rights. They were systematically dispossessing small miners using forged documents and official corruption to transfer valuable resources to large syndicates. During one brief respite, eyes met across the chaotic work site. Sweat, coal dust, and determination streaked both faces, but something else was present, recognition transcending circumstances and speaking to fundamental truths about partnership forged in crisis. "Hold still," she murmured, tying fresh bandage around his waist, with hands lingering longer than medically necessary. "You have gentle hands," he observed, studying her face in lamplight. "But strong ones, too. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become." "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm worthy of faith he showed." "You saved children tonight. You've risked your life for justice. How could any father not be proud of such courage?" The intimacy wasn't lost on either, nor the absolute trust it represented. In harsh land where survival often meant choosing yourself over others, they consistently chose each other not from weakness, but from strength multiplying when shared between worthy partners. The rescue consumed 8 precious hours, but proved successful. They saved 4 men from collapsed mine, dragging them through twisted metal and broken stone, though 3 others died before reaching them, sobering reminder that courage couldn't always triumph over circumstance and timing. Among the rescued was Supervisor Davies, a grizzled Welshman with leather hands and steel eyes. As they prepared continuing their interrupted journey, Davies pulled Koda aside with crucial information. "Saw something at Whirlwind Pass might interest you considerable," he said quietly. "Rourke's boys, using old Canyon Corral to rebrand stolen horses, saw them 5 days past, working over fine Indian ponies with traditional markings. Beautiful animals, but changing every brand to pass territorial inspection. Precisely the confirmation they desperately needed, direct eyewitness evidence linking Rourke to systematic horse theft. But Whirlwind Pass lay opposite direction from Medicine Bow, and Pike's condition was deteriorating. "We go to the pass first," Koda decided after consideration. "If we can gather concrete proof, Marshal Merritt will have everything needed for arrests standing up in any court." Pike nodded despite worsening wound, though his face had taken alarming grayish pallor, suggesting internal bleeding. "I know that trail like my backyard. We can make Whirlwind Pass by dawn, pushing hard." But Pike's determination couldn't overcome injury reality. An hour into their journey, he collapsed from blood loss and fever, forcing them to camp in sheltered grove, while Leonora did what she could, stabilizing his condition. "He needs a real doctor," she said after examining the wound by lamplight. "This is beyond field medicine." "Nearest doctor is back in Carbon Creek," Guinevere observed. "Exactly where Crow expects us to go." As they debated options, Pike regained consciousness long enough to make a decision haunting them all. "Go on without me," he whispered through cracked lips. "Take wagon and team. I'll find my way back when able." "We're not leaving you to die alone," Leonora protested. "You're not leaving me to die," Pike replied with grim humor. "You're leaving me to cover your trail in slow pursuit. I can still handle a rifle, and these bones have tricks left." He pressed folded paper into Coda's hands, crude map showing Whirlwind Pass location and Hidden Canyon, where stolen horses were rebranded. "Heinrich drew this before he died," Pike explained. "Said if anything happened, someone might need finding that place to recover evidence." The treacherous trail to Whirlwind Pass wound through unforgiving country red rock formations carved into fantastic shapes resembling sleeping giants or ancient temples' steep-sided canyons where missteps meant death on knife-sharp rocks. The wagon moved agonizingly slowly through darkness, following paths barely wide enough for wheels while drop-offs yawned like hungry mouths. Dawn painted eastern sky in gold and crimson when they finally reached Hidden Canyon Housing Illegal Corral. It was natural formation cleverly enlarged by human hands, featuring sturdy fencing, reliable water access, and perfect concealment ideal for holding stolen livestock while brands were systematically altered. But the corral stood ominously empty, except for 3 dead horses' bodies attracting circling buzzards. Several leather saddlebags had been left behind, probably by riders killed in flash flood, sweeping through 5 days earlier. Inside abandoned saddlebags, they discovered something changing everything they understood about the criminal conspiracy's scope and organization. However, it wasn't Blackjack Crow's complete ledger as expected. Instead, they found fragments. Partially burned paper's water-damaged correspondence, and most intriguingly, a single sheet bearing handwriting that made Leonora's blood run cold. She stared at the careful script recognition and horror dawning. But this time, the revelation came not from finding everything laid out perfectly, but from piecing together clues that had been haunting her subconsciously. "Sweet, merciful heaven," she breathed. "I've seen this handwriting before, but not where I thought." She pulled out one of the wanted posters they'd seen plastered around Carbon Creek, the crude sketch of Coda with the reward information. Studying the text carefully, her accounting-trained eye caught something others would miss. "Look at these letter formations," she said, pointing to specific words. "The way the H connects to other letters, the particular slant of the M, it's the same hand that wrote the reward notice as these burned fragments." Coda studied both documents. "You're certain?" "Papa trained me to spot document forgeries. It was part of his accounting work in Hamburg. This is definitely the same person's handwriting, which means Montgomery Hale isn't just involved in land fraud?" Coda finished grimly. "He's actively coordinating the manhunt against us." But the burned fragments revealed only pieces of the larger picture. They could see references to the Medicine Bow meeting and final disposition of evidence. But crucial details remained tantalizingly incomplete. "We need the complete ledger," Leonora said, studying the fragments. "These pieces suggest it exists, but whoever destroyed these documents was careful to leave nothing that could convict them alone." "Then we get it from the source," Coda decided. "If Hale has the complete records, we take them from him." Their urgent plans were suddenly interrupted by that blood-chilling, sound-distant rumble of massive water breaking free. The spring flood combined with recent storms and Rourke's poorly constructed dam had finally overwhelmed makeshift engineering that had been stealing water from legitimate farmers for months. A wall of brown debris-filled water raced down the canyon toward them with unstoppable force, carrying broken trees, dead animals, and scattered remains of human ambition in churning depths. The sound grew steadily louder, continuous roar, speaking of millions of gallons, seeking lowest ground with irresistible momentum. Leonora's hands began shaking as the full reality became clear. They were trapped in narrow canyon with flood approaching from upstream and Crow's men almost certainly closing from behind. Death seemed reaching from every direction. But this time, when Coda took her trembling hands, something had changed between them. The terror was still there, but underneath it was something stronger, absolute trust forged through trials that had tested them both to their limits. "Look at me," he said, voice carrying calm authority. "We are not going to die in this place. Do you hear me? We have work to finish, justice to serve, and a future to build together." The simple declaration of faith in their shared survival and future gradually slowed her racing heart and cleared her mind of panic. She could see unshakable strength in his weathered face, absolute refusal to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. "What do we do?" she asked, voice steadying as she drew strength from his unwavering confidence. "We climb," he said, pointing to narrow ledge zigzagging up canyon wall like natural staircase carved by centuries of wind and weather. "The flood can't reach us there, and we can work our way to higher ground." The ascent proved nightmarish. They abandoned everything except essential supplies and precious evidence fragments, beginning desperate climb with rocks shifting beneath feet. The ledge was barely wide enough for one person forcing single-file movement, while roar of approaching water grew steadily louder. Halfway up the canyon wall, disaster nearly claimed them both. A section crumbled under Coda's weight, sending him sliding toward precipice, with nothing but empty air and certain death below. Only Leonora's quick reflexes saved him. She grabbed his wrist with both hands and held on grimly, while his feet scrambled for purchase on crumbling rock. "I can't hold you," she gasped, small hands slipping on blood-slick skin. "Yes, you can," he replied with absolute conviction. "You're stronger than you know, and I'm not ready to leave you alone in this world." Using her grip as anchor, he managed to swing legs up and find foothold, pulling himself back onto narrow ledge, just as floodwaters exploded into canyon below, with force of thousands stampeding buffalo. From their precarious perch, they watched nature's judgment sweep through narrow passage with awesome, terrifying power. The torrent carried away years of criminal activity in one devastating rush, along with any immediate hope of reaching Medicine Bow by direct route. "Railroad," Coda said grimly as water began receding. "There's a depot at Medicine Bow Station. If we can reach it tonight, we might catch eastbound train to Medicine Bow and beat Hale to his meeting with the marshal." It represented their final option, but meant traveling across open country in daylight with limited supplies and no transportation except their feet. The odds grew worse with every mile, but surrender had never been among choices they were willing to consider. The day-long trek across broken country tested every ounce of endurance and determination they possessed. They moved from cover to cover, like hunted animals using every available scrap of concealment to avoid search parties they knew were combing territory with systematic thoroughness. But this journey also provided opportunities for deeper conversation during brief rest stops. The shared near-death experience on the canyon wall had broken down remaining barriers between them, and they found themselves talking with the openness of people who had looked death in the face together and survived. "My grandfather was a great warrior," Coda said during one rest beside a hidden spring. fought at Little Bighorn, lived to see his people confined to reservation. He taught me that a warrior's greatest weapon isn't his bow or rifle, but his dedication to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Is that why you do this work, tracking criminals, recovering stolen property? Partly, but also because I believe good people of all races can live together in peace if law applies equally to everyone. Your father understood that he helped me recover horses stolen from Blackfoot. Children didn't ask for payment, just wanted to see justice done. Leonora shared her own memories of growing up in Prussia, her father's dreams of American opportunity, and her struggles to find place in society that didn't know what to do with educated women wanting to use their skills meaningfully. Papa always said America would be different. She explained while they rested in shade of massive boulder. Said it was a place where what you could do mattered more than who your father was or what class you were born into. But sometimes I wonder if those opportunities really exist for women, especially out here. They exist for women brave enough to seize them. Coda replied. Look at what you've accomplished in 4 days. Escaped kidnappers, helped rescue trapped minors, provided crucial evidence that will bring down criminal conspiracy. Most men couldn't have done as much. The conversation revealed depths in both that went far beyond immediate circumstances. They were discovering not just physical attraction or bonds forged by shared danger, but genuine compatibility of mind and spirit, suggesting their partnership might endure long beyond current crisis. There's something I need to tell you, Leonora said as they approached the final stretch to Medicine Bow Station. Something I haven't mentioned because I wasn't sure it mattered, but now. She pulled out her father's small leather-bound notebook, not the ledger they discussed, but something else entirely. This contains more than just Papa's business records. In the weeks before he died, he was corresponding with another accountant who'd noticed similar irregularities in territorial filings. Coda studied the notebook with growing interest. Another accountant. Someone working inside the territorial office itself. Papa never told me the person's name, said it was too dangerous, but they were feeding him information about forged documents and suspicious transactions. She opened to a specific page. Look at this, the last entry Papa made before he took sick. The entry was brief but chilling. Contact confirms suspicions about MH. We'll have complete proof after Medicine Bow meeting on May 15th. If something happens to me, L must get this evidence to federal authorities. Trust no one in territorial government. May 15th. Coda said quietly. That's tomorrow. Papa died before he could attend that meeting, but his contact might still be there. Someone inside the territorial office who was working with him to expose the corruption. The revelation changed everything. They weren't just racing to prevent Hale from destroying evidence, they were racing to meet Heinrich Sinclair's mysterious contact, who might have the complete proof they needed. But first, they had to survive the next few hours. Medicine Bow Station sat beside the railroad tracks, like beacon of civilization windows glowing warmly against gathering dusk. But as they approached through tall grass, they could see their enemies had anticipated this destination. At least a dozen riders were positioned around the station, rifles glinting in afternoon sunlight as they maintained patient vigil. But worse was yet to come. As they studied the situation from concealment, they watched a small group of riders approach from Carbon Creek's direction. Among them, unmistakably, was Dr. Solomon. But something was wrong. Instead of riding as prisoner, he appeared to be leading the group, pointing toward various positions around the depot as if giving orders. The betrayal hit like physical blow. The man who had helped them, who had treated their wounds and provided sanctuary, was apparently working with their enemies. No, Leonora whispered, staring at the scene with disbelief. He saved us. He shot that man to protect us. Maybe he had no choice then, Coda said grimly, though his own voice carried doubt and disappointment. Maybe they got to him afterward, convinced him to cooperate. But even as they processed this betrayal, the situation at Depot unfolded with agonizing complexity. Solomon wasn't just pointing out positions he was arguing with the other men, his body language suggesting disagreement rather than cooperation. Then they saw something that made their blood run cold, a small figure being dragged from one of the buildings. Even at distance, they could see it was a young woman, probably in her teens, with the same general build and coloring as Dr. Solomon. His daughter. Coda breathed. But instead of the revelation providing immediate clarity, it raised more questions. Was Solomon cooperating to save his daughter? Or was this some more complex deception? They couldn't be sure, and in their current situation, uncertainty could prove fatal. A train whistle echoed across prairie, announcing arrival of eastbound express that would carry Montgomery Hale to his meeting with Deputy Marshal Merritt in Medicine Bow, or carry the evidence to federal authorities if they could somehow get aboard. They were running out of time, and their enemies controlled every approach to station. But giving up wasn't an option. Too many lives depended on getting the truth to authorities before Hale could destroy evidence and escape justice. We need to know if Solomon is ally or enemy, Coda said, studying tactical situation with Warrior's eye for weakness and opportunity. How do we find out without exposing ourselves? Before he could answer, the decision was made for them. A lone rider approached their position from behind, moving with stealth of someone who had been tracking them for hours. But instead of raising alarm, the man dismounted and approached their hiding place with hands visible and empty. It was Andrew Pike, somehow still alive, despite his wounds, and riding a horse that looked as exhausted as its rider. His face was gray with pain and blood loss, but his eyes burned with determination of a man who had made peace with mortality and intended to make his remaining time count. "Thought I might find you here," he said quietly, settling into concealment beside them. "Figured you'd try for the train." "How did you survive?" Leonora asked, voice filled with amazement and relief. "Old soldiers are hard to kill," Pike replied with grim humor. "And I had unfinished business. Been watching Depot for 2 hours, counting men and looking for weaknesses." He pulled out pocket watch and checked time with practiced efficiency. "Train's due in 20 minutes. Hale's already here, saw him arrive an hour ago with small army of hired guns." Pike's expression grew even grimmer as he shared intelligence, changing their understanding completely. "But there's something else. Dr. Solomon isn't betraying you, he's being forced. They've got his daughter, and they're using her as leverage to make him cooperate." "We know first, then why is he giving them orders?" "He's not. He's trying to convince them to position men where they'll be least effective when the shooting starts. I watched him argue with Rourke for 10 minutes, insisting certain positions were better when anyone with military experience could see they were terrible. The revelation recast everything they'd observed. Solomon wasn't betraying them. He was trying to help while protecting his daughter, playing a desperate game that could cost both their lives if discovered. "What do you propose?" Coda asked. Pike smiled grimly, expression of a man who had already written his own epitaph. "I propose we give them a fight they'll never forget. Give Dr. Solomon the distraction he needs to get his daughter to safety." He gestured toward his horse, where several sticks of dynamite were secured to the saddle. "Mining explosives I was supposed to deliver before all this started. Figured they might come in handy." The plan they devised was desperate and dangerous, but offered their only hope. Pike would create massive diversion by detonating explosives near freight shed, drawing criminals' attention away from main platform. In confusion, Coda and Leonora would attempt to reach train and board it before Hale could escape with his lies and forged documents. But there was more to the plan. During the chaos, they would also try to signal Dr. Solomon, letting him know they understood his situation and giving him opportunity to protect his daughter. "One more thing," Pike said as they prepared to implement their desperate gambit. "If something happens to me, you need to know that Heinrich Sinclair's mysterious contact and the one who was feeding him information from inside the territorial office, that person will be on tomorrow's train to Medicine Bow." "How do you know?" "Because I've been in contact with them myself. Same person who helped your father, Miss Leonora. They're carrying the complete evidence we need, but they're also walking into a trap if Hale realizes they exist." The train whistle sounded again, closer this time, as Eastbound Express approached Medicine Bow Station with punctuality that had made railroad the marvel of the age. Steam and smoke rose from locomotive stack, visible above tree line, as Iron Horse carried both salvation and damnation toward their final confrontation. "Time to go," Pike said simply, checking his weapons one final time. "Whatever happens, remember that we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. We're fighting for the idea that justice can triumph over corruption, that ordinary people can stand up to organized evil and win." The final battle began exactly as planned, with Pike's explosives creating thunderous diversion that sent Crow's men running toward freight shed in confusion and alarm. The explosion was tremendous, powerful enough to shatter windows throughout depot and send column of smoke and debris high into sky. But the chaos that followed proved more complex than anticipated. Instead of simple confusion, the explosion triggered a carefully orchestrated response that suggested their enemies had been prepared for such tactics. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Crow's men realized the explosion was diversion and refocused attention on real targets. But their positions, influenced by Dr. Solomon's deliberately poor advice, left them exposed and poorly coordinated. Coda and Leonora made their desperate dash toward train platform, counting on speed and surprise to carry them through enemy lines before organized resistance could form. The Winchester barked repeatedly in Coda's hands as he provided covering fire, each shot carefully aimed to drive back attackers while conserving ammunition. Leonora ran beside him with Colt in her hands, fear transformed into grim determination that would have made her father proud. She was no longer the terrified woman who had stumbled into his cabin 4 days ago. She had become someone capable of facing death to see justice done. They had almost reached platform when the real trap was sprung. Mean Mike Rourke emerged from concealment with 6 men cutting off their approach to train, while Black Jack Crow himself appeared on platform with equal number of armed followers. But this time, the brothers had made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to capture their quarry, they had positioned themselves too close to Dr. Solomon and his daughter, giving the doctor the opportunity he'd been desperately waiting for. Solomon suddenly broke free from his captors and shouted warning that allowed Coda and Leonora to dive for cover behind baggage cart just as concentrated gunfire erupted from both directions. But more importantly, his action created the distraction that allowed his daughter to break free and run toward relative safety of the train cars. The battle that followed was unlike anything in their previous encounters. This wasn't desperate flight or hasty ambush. This was prolonged, vicious combat between determined enemies who understood that only one side would survive. Montgomery Hale appeared on platform, his face pale with fear, but satchel of documents clutched protectively against chest. He was shouting orders to gunmen around him, but his words were lost in continuous roar of gunfire and hiss of locomotive steam. The train was already beginning to slow for its scheduled stop, engineer apparently unaware of battle raging around his locomotive. Steam hissed from brakes as Express prepared to take on passengers and mail offering salvation for those who could reach it. In middle of chaos, Black Jack Crow made decision that transformed tactical situation completely. Desperate to ensure no witnesses survived to testify against him, he grabbed Dr. Solomon himself. Not his daughter who had escaped, but the man who had been forced to betray his own principles to protect her. "Everybody stop shooting," Crow bellowed above gunfire. "Stop shooting or the good doctor dies right here." The command carried across platform with absolute authority, and gradually firearms fell silent as everyone processed new reality. Solomon stood perfectly still in Crow's grip knife, pressed to his throat, but his eyes met Coda's across the platform with expression of grim satisfaction. His daughter was safe. Whatever happened to him now, he had achieved his primary goal. "Let him go," Leonora called out, her voice carrying clearly across platform. "Your fight is with us, not with a man trying to protect his child. My fight is with anyone who threatens my business," Crow replied coldly. "And right now that includes this interfering doctor and you two troublemakers hiding behind that cart." He tightened grip on knife, and thin line of blood appeared on Solomon's throat, where blade pressed against skin. "Here's how this works. You throw out your weapons and surrender, or I cut this throat and start working on everyone else I can catch." The standoff stretched like taut wire, ready to snap everyone frozen. While terrified, Solomon maintained his dignity, and the approaching train continued its inexorable approach to platform. Death hung in air like smoke from gunpowder. But this time, instead of Coda making the sacrifice, it was Leonora who stepped forward with a plan that changed everything. "You want your business protected," she called out to Crow. "Then you need to know that killing us won't solve your problem. We're not the only ones who know about your operation." She held up her father's notebook, making sure everyone could see it clearly. "This contains complete records of every forged document, every stolen piece of property, every crime you've committed over the past 3 years. And there are copies, multiple copies already in the hands of federal authorities." It was a bluff, but delivered with such conviction that even Crow hesitated. "You're lying," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Am I then explain how we knew exactly where to find your canyon corral? Explain how we knew about the Medicine Bow meeting? Explain how we knew Montgomery Hale was your inside man before we ever found that burned ledger?" She was playing for time, hoping to create enough doubt and confusion to give them opportunity to act. But she was also telling partial truth. Heinrich Sinclair's mysterious contact did have additional evidence, and they were presumably on their way to Medicine Bow even now. Hale himself stepped forward, his face twisted with rage and fear. "She's trying to trick you, Jack. Kill them both and be done with it. We can clean up any loose ends later." But Crow wasn't convinced. He was a criminal, but he wasn't stupid, and something in Leonora's manner suggested she wasn't bluffing about everything. "What copies?" he demanded. "Who has them?" "Someone your inside man never suspected," Leonora replied. "Someone who's been documenting your crimes from the beginning and is already on their way to meet with federal marshals." The psychological pressure was working. Crow's grip on Solomon loosened slightly as he tried to process implications of what she was saying. If there really were other people with evidence, killing the witnesses at the depot wouldn't be enough. That moment of distraction was what Dr. Solomon had been waiting for. With sudden movement that belied his scholarly appearance, he drove his elbow back into Crow's ribs and twisted away from the knife, creating the opening that Coda and Leonora needed. But instead of simple rescue, what followed was the most complex and dangerous confrontation of their entire ordeal. Multiple groups of armed men engaged in running gun battle across the platform, while the train continued approaching its massive bulk, offering both cover and additional danger. Rourke and his men tried to flank them from one side, while Crow's gang pressed from the other. Hale attempted to board the train with his documents, but found his way blocked by the engineer and conductor, who had finally realized what was happening and were determined not to let their train be used in criminal escape. In the midst of this chaos, Leonora made a decision that epitomized how much she had changed during their ordeal. Instead of seeking safety, she deliberately exposed herself to danger, running directly toward Hale, with her father's knife in hand, and murder in her heart for the man who had corrupted everything her father had worked to build. Hale saw her coming and drew a small pistol, but his hand was shaking from fear and he missed his shot. She tackled him to platform's wooden planking, and they struggled for control of both his weapon and the satchel of forged documents. Meanwhile, Coda found himself facing Blackjack Crow in personal combat that went beyond mere criminality to something approaching warfare between different philosophies of life. Crow fought with brutality and desperation of someone who had never acknowledged any authority beyond his own appetite for power and wealth. "You think you're better than me, Chief?" Crow snarled as they grappled for control of his knife. "You think your people got some special claim to righteousness? I seen what happens on reservations. You're all just beggars waiting for government handouts." "My people survive," Coda replied grimly, using leverage and training to gradually gain advantage. "Your people only know how to take from others. That's why you'll lose in the end." The fight was brutal and personal, with both men understanding that only one would walk away alive. But it was also symbolic, a confrontation between someone who had spent his life protecting others and someone who had spent his life exploiting them. The battle's turning point came when Deputy Marshal Claude Merritt finally appeared, not emerging from the train as expected, but arriving with a small army of federal agents who had been tracking the criminal conspiracy from multiple directions. But Merritt's arrival didn't end the fighting immediately. Instead, it intensified it, as Crow's men realized they were facing federal arrest and possible hanging, giving them nothing to lose by fighting to the death. What followed was the most intense gunfight in Medicine Bow Station's history, with federal agents, local criminals, and innocent bystanders all caught in deadly crossfire. The train itself became both fortress and battleground, with people taking cover behind its massive wheels and iron sides, while bullets flew in every direction. In the midst of this chaos, the truth about Dr. Solomon's situation finally became clear. His daughter hadn't just been kidnapped, she had been used as leverage to force him to provide information about everyone who came to him for medical treatment, including details about their injuries, their plans, and their associates. But Solomon had been playing a deeper game than anyone realized. While appearing to cooperate with criminals, he had actually been documenting everything they told him, creating detailed records of their organization, their crimes, and their plans. His apparent betrayal had actually been the most dangerous kind of undercover work imaginable. "I've been building a case against them for 2 years," he told Coda during brief lull in fighting. "Ever since they first used my medical practice to cover their crimes. But I couldn't act until I was sure my daughter was safe." The final resolution came not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the power of evidence and law. When Hale's satchel was finally captured and opened, it contained not just forged documents, but detailed records of the entire criminal conspiracy, including names, dates, amounts, and methods that would allow federal authorities to dismantle the entire network. Heinrich Sinclair's mysterious contact turned out to be the territorial surveyor's assistant, a young woman named Mary Catherine, who had been copying suspicious documents and comparing them with original survey records for over a year. Her evidence, combined with Leonora's father's records and Dr. Solomon's documentation, provided overwhelming proof of systematic corruption that reached into highest levels of territorial government. Blackjack Crow died as he had lived violently and without remorse, refusing surrender, even when surrounded by federal agents and facing certain death. His brother Mike Rourke was captured alive, but severely wounded, and would eventually provide testimony that led to arrests throughout 3 territories. Montgomery Hale faced with overwhelming evidence, and certain execution provided detailed confession about entire criminal network in exchange for life imprisonment instead of hanging. His cooperation exposed corrupt officials, crooked surveyors, and criminal buyers across vast area of American frontier. But the cost had been terrible. Andrew Pike died from his injuries sustained in final battle, his sacrifice directly responsible for victory over forces that had terrorized region for years. Dr. Solomon survived, but bore permanent scars from his ordeal, both physical and emotional. Several innocent bystanders were wounded in crossfire, and Medicine Bow Station itself required extensive repairs before trains could run normally again. In aftermath, as wounded were tended and criminals were secured, Coda felt strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served, corrupt officials would face trial, stolen property would be returned to rightful owners, and territory would be safer for decent people trying to build honest lives. But something profound had also ended, not just criminal conspiracy, but the intense shared experience that had forged unbreakable bond between him and Leonora. They had been through hell together and emerged victorious, but now they faced question of what came next in a world where their survival no longer depended on each other. 2 months later, Territorial Courthouse in Carbon hosted ceremony honoring those who had risked lives to bring criminal conspiracy to justice. Coda received official recognition from Territorial Governor for his role in recovering stolen tribal property and assisting in investigation that changed frontier law enforcement forever. Dr. Solomon was cleared of any wrongdoing and received commendation for his courage in gathering evidence under extremely dangerous circumstances. His daughter, traumatized but physically unharmed, was slowly recovering with help of counselors and support from community that had learned to appreciate her father's sacrifices. Guinevere Sloan was praised for her courage in protecting children under her care and was offered position as Territorial Education Supervisor, recognizing her organizational skills and dedication to learning. The new school, built to replace the one destroyed by Crow's men, became model for educational institutions throughout region. But it was Leonora who received most significant honor appointment as first female Territorial Auditor, tasked with reviewing and verifying all land transactions, water rights transfers, and mining claims to prevent future fraud. Her father's dream of seeing his daughter's abilities recognized and utilized had finally been realized, though in circumstances he never could have imagined. On crisp morning in late November, with first snow dusting Dakota hills, Coda completed his final task as tracker by returning last of recovered horses to Lakota Reservation. The sacred animals that carried spirits of ancestors in their bloodlines were finally home, and their ordeal ended, and their future secure. Leonora had established herself a new position with characteristic thoroughness and attention to detail, creating systematic procedures that would prevent widespread fraud that had plagued territory for years. Her work was challenging and rewarding, offering intellectual stimulation and social contribution her father had always believed she deserved. But most evenings found them together, sharing meals and conversation in small house they had purchased on outskirts of Eagle Fork. Their relationship had evolved naturally from shared danger to mutual respect to genuine love, built on foundation of proven loyalty and common values that could weather any storm. They had survived because they had trusted each other, completely fought for each other without reservation, and refused to surrender to evil regardless of personal cost. Their love story had been forged in fire and tempered by adversity, making it strong enough to endure whatever challenges future might bring. "What happens next?" she asked one evening as they sat on porch watching sunset over prairie-painting sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of peace and new beginnings. "We build the life we want," he replied, his hand finding hers with easy familiarity of gesture repeated many times. "We serve justice when it calls. We help our neighbors when they need it. and we trust that tomorrow will be better than today, because we're working to make it so. As winter settled over Wyoming territory, bringing promise of renewal that came with each changing season, Coda and Leonora continued work of building something lasting and worthwhile from ashes of corruption and violence. They had proven that two people who refused to surrender to evil could indeed change world one act of courage at a time. The collar had been burned to ashes, and scattered on wind criminal ledger had become evidence of justice served and evil punished, and trail ahead belonged entirely to them to follow wherever their shared courage and commitment might lead. In end, they had discovered that love wasn't just about surviving together. It was about building something better together, about creating future worthy of sacrifices made to achieve it. Their partnership would endure not just because they had faced death together, but because they had chosen life together, choosing to believe in possibility of justice, hope, and happiness, even in harshest circumstances.